All right, students, so today we're going to talk about Immanuel Kant. Before we get there, I wanted to review a couple of things. What we've seen so far is a couple of ethical systems championed by some people who weren't exactly Christian believers. The one that we saw from Hobbes is called ethical egoism. So you'll want to remember that term. It definitely showed up in the Ray textbook. And then the other one that we saw here is emotivism from David Hume, although we didn't specifically identify that with him when we went through it. But the bottom line is, since you can't really know for sure of any moral principles outside of human reasoning and human feelings about what's right and wrong, and right and wrong are ultimately grounded in human feelings. And so that's sometimes referred to as the moral sense theory, sometimes referred to as emotivism. It's just whatever we feel is right, because again, we're just human perceivers, and this is the best we can do. That's sort of the bottom line there. Okay, so those are two crucial theories there coming out of kind of existential and empiricist philosophy. All right, so we move on now to Kant. And Immanuel Kant, just so you know, he's a very difficult philosopher. I recommend that you read him a little bit, but it's going to be tough slogging if you try to do that. But I want to kind of go over some of the main ideas there, and then also talk about his ethical contributions. So the main contribution here in philosophy for Kant is to look at number 3 there in your notes. Hopefully you have your packets out by now. The basic idea there is reversal and correspondence, right? So he believed actually that what he was contributing is a Copernican revolution in philosophy. But the basic idea there being that obviously Copernicus sort of proved that due to the kind of elliptical motions of the planets across the night sky instead of perfect lines, he sort of proved that the Earth was not the center of the solar system, but the Sun had to be the center of the solar system. So taking from that same kind of idea, what Kant suggests is that the way we've understood human knowledge going all the way back is probably incorrect. Most people thought that we sort of bring in the raw material of experiences, and then the mind crunches that data and then creates ideas and things like that. It was sort of Hume's idea, but others would probably suggest that as well, the vast majority. So the world is sort of active, the mind's passive, receives this information and then stitches it together in various ways. Well, what Kant does is he suggests that maybe the mind is the active thing. So maybe in a sense the mind is lurching out, grasping hold of experiences, and then forcing them into certain arrangements. So understanding is not something like an object brought into the mind. Understanding is something that's sort of projected onto the world, right? So this is a very different way of sort of thinking about this. So let's give you the blanks here real quick. All right, obviously A, reversal and correspondence. C, notice there we've got a blank. Understanding is projected onto the object from the inside out. All right. So we come to the world with, he called them the 12 categories of the understanding. We're not going to bog down too much in all the details here, but we've got this kind of filter, right, that interprets experiences. So that's the blank, the next blank there in C. This is sort of an internal filter. One of the crucial filters that we have is time-space, right? So we're time-space creatures. We're sort of forced to understand the world in terms of time-space. And so, therefore, he sees causation as something that's within the mind. It's one of the categories of the understanding that's projected on the world. Remember, we saw with Hume there was a problem about causation. He believed that we couldn't really know that we know that it actually exists, since it's just an idea that we kind of came up with to make sense of our own perceptions about things. Well, Kant's basically saying we can know these 12 categories, that they're sort of firm categories of the mind, and they're projected onto the world. You just know them in a different way. You know them, the term is a priori. You may remember that term. Okay, so, an analogy here, you'll notice under C, that kind of helps with this is think in terms of the computer operating system. But imagine that computer operating system didn't just sit there passively and receive data from either the internet or software that's put onto it and that kind of thing. But that it actually is reaching out and grasping data that it finds useful and then arranging it in certain ways. Well, that's sort of what Kant has to say about how the mind works. All right. So D there kind of deals with what I've already covered on time space, that kind of thing. But one illustration of this could be this. I mean, do we think that a fish knows the world in the same way that human beings would, or a dog or a cat? We look at them and it doesn't look like they show any evidence of actually understanding causal relations in things at the deep level that we do. And maybe they do understand that if I'm hungry and I go over and I eat that food, that's going to fix this hunger problem. They're real basic rudimentary things. But do they have a sense of chains of causes and effects that are really complicated? Chains of causes and effects, probably not so much. Obviously, that's why they don't have dolphin hospitals or cat hospitals, things like that. So in other words, he's trying to say that human beings are unique in the sense that we are human knowers, right? Cats are going to be cat knowers. They're going to have maybe only 2 of these categories of the understanding, or maybe they'll have more of them, but they won't have them in as much depth as a human being would say. All right, so letter E here. Our mind structures experiences in such a way that we see cause and effect relationships, and we see them at a deep level. So it's a time-bound notion. We're looking at not just what comes before, but what's causing, right? So he's not going for a post hoc kind of fallacy here. He's just trying to show us that because we're time-bound creatures, we naturally look at time relations, and we look even deeper than that in the time relations to try to see if there's a causal relationship. Okay, F there, therefore, experience doesn't shape and form us. We shape and inform our experiences into meaningful connections. So human beings have this unique capacity of shaping experience. So if you want to think of the world as sort of, it's out there, he calls it, by the way, the phenomenal, the noumenal world. And then the human mind has these 12 categories, which sort of project this interpretive filter on the noumenal world and force it into a certain kind of color. Maybe almost think of it, maybe the computer analogy didn't help you, but if you think in terms of human beings have, rose-colored glasses, right? And dogs maybe have red-colored glasses. Who knows what their perception of things is. But human beings have a unique way of perceiving things, and this leads to cause and effect. It forces us to sort of see things in terms of cause and effect, where maybe other creatures wouldn't. So he thinks he solves Hume's skepticism, Hume's problem here, by just simply saying that causation is not something in the world. So in that sense, he thinks that Hume is right. Hume's made a good and valuable contribution to philosophy in that regard. But to say that we can't know it, that's a leap that Kant's not ready to make. I mean, Kant simply says, well, maybe we can know it, but we know it intuitively. We know it instinctively as a basic category of our understanding. So that would be sort of his take on that part of it. Now, let's break down that metaphysics a little bit further here. So number 4, you'll see you've got a couple of points here. Letter A, we only have access to things subjected to our interpretive apparatus as human knowers. So what he's simply saying there is, if something's not actually subjected to us in concrete ways in our experience in the world, then we can't really know these things. So he has some skepticism here about, for example, God, heaven, spirits, things of that nature. Because those are not things that we have encountered in our phenomenal experience of the noumenal. So again, I'll break that down more, but letter B, so let's do that now as a matter of fact. The noumenal world, what he means by that is that's the world as it is. That's the world, the chair as it is in itself, let's say. The chair as the chair knows itself, if the chairs could know themselves. I don't know why philosophers think in this way, but it's, his point is kind of an interesting one, because you think about something that maybe is a little bit more obvious, like, your cat or your dog or something like that. Well, you can't get into the consciousness of your cat or your dog. So do you really know that cat or dog? I mean, you know the cat as you as a human knower can know the cat. but do you know the cat as the cat is in and of itself, right? So in that sense, we're sort of cut off from true knowledge about reality. It's not something that we know in and of itself. We're experiencing it as a human experiencer. So that's the blank there, by the way, the next one. We only know the world as human experiencers, or human knowers, which again is this complex of real things out there. So he's not denying there's real objects out there, real subjects out there. But they're subjected to our interpretive filters, the 12 categories of the understanding. And what this does is it gives us a picture of reality, a phenomenal experience, okay, which is not the same thing as the noumenal, all right? So there's a few other questions here. Can we know a table? Can we know an immortal soul? Can we know God? No, these are things that can be thought about, but not known in and of themselves. All right. He says the notion of the eternal is meaningless for a mind that must project time and space, cause-effect relations upon the world. So, by the way, that's an interesting question. It almost seems like it validates a lot of what Kant is saying. I mean, if you think about the eternal for a second, obviously we've done this a little bit in class, but it kind of blows the mind when you start pondering this, because if there's a creature, a being out there who simply does not swim through a sequence of events in their life, right? There's no A, then B, then C, and so forth, but there's just an ongoing now. Can you really relate to that idea? Can you relate to that concept in any way? I mean, again, you can think about it, you can try to imagine it, I suppose, but to know it as it really is just simply going to be impossible, because you're forced into knowing the world in terms of time and space, because that's one of the interpretive filters that you have in the mind, according to Kant. So if God does have that kind of experience, we're going to have to be largely agnostic about it, right? Because he's going to be a being who takes in all events in one sort of ongoing moment, ongoing now. So, Kant basically is saying there that you got to be agnostic or skeptical about such things, because we as human knowers are obviously going to be cut off from those kinds of reality. Okay, so that's one illustration that just to try to help Kant here, giving Christian theology, that kind of thing. All right, letter D, most philosophers believe he destroyed the ontological argument. By the way, I didn't get into what Hume has to say about the teleological argument, so maybe I'll cover that here along with Kant's takedown of the ontological argument. But these are important for us as Christians, because these are arguments that are traditionally, they've been viewed as being pretty strong to try to help us understand the existence of God. And these two philosophers do a pretty good number on at least a couple of versions of it. So let's deal with the design argument first with Hume, and then we'll get back to what we're talking about here with Kant and what he does with the ontological. So Hume, what he says about the teleological argument is that, again, remember, everything for him is about experience. And so what are we actually experiencing in the world? Well, what we're experiencing is certain things that seem to cry out for design, right? Rather complicated structures, where you have to have all of the various parts working simultaneously, that kind of thing. And so what he says, though, is that the most that can give us is a being whose intelligence is remotely like our own. That sort of being is responsible for the world as we see it. But now, he says, what does that really tell us about the character of this being? Not much. What does it tell us about whether or not he's willing to engage the world now? Again, not much. In fact, he goes through this whole litany. By the way, this is in Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion. He goes through this whole litany of possibilities. One being that you have a God who's sort of an infant deity, and he sort of blew it in his first experiment, so he had to start over, and maybe we're like the third iteration of the world, but it's quite imperfect, judging by, again, just our observations of things. It looks like a lot of things in the world seem to be pretty broken. So in that case, maybe this is a being who's kind of not particularly competent, as a creator. It could be that there's a competition going on among gods about who's going to have the best world, right? And so you got all these different gods, and this is only one version of one god. So, so his conclusion then from this whole litany of possibilities and sort of pressing teleological design arguments to say that it's not really giving us much to go on, right? It just tells us that an intelligence remotely like our own might be responsible for the world, but what he wants to do with that is just sort of yawn at it, and he doesn't see it as much of a challenge to his just assumption of naturalism, and that maybe all he can really know that he knows is just his experiences in the world and that sort of thing. Now, I suppose Christians could kind of yawn back at Hume and just sort of say, well, here's the thing, though. I mean, maybe Hume's right. Maybe it's just that all the teleological argument gives us is enough evidence to suggest that there's an intelligence behind the world. Frankly, I think that that's where a lot of design apologists go with their arguments, just to say that intelligence like ours is responsible for the world. And they're like, the other things Hume has to say are not that important. Because if you want to talk about this being maybe not being good or not being competent and so forth, you have to bring in other kinds of arguments there, right? You have to bring in things like the cosmological argument, that sort of thing, the moral argument. If you bring those things together, then I have a pretty stout argument for God's existence. Okay, well, what about Kant? What is his takedown of the ontological argument? All right, let's look at that for just a second. Now, what he has to say there is that you have to understand a little bit of background here on this. The ontological argument comes from Anselm, and Anselm's basic argument was that we have a certain content in the mind. We have a whole bunch of stuff there, some imaginary things, some real things, and it turns out that some of these things, are lesser and greater, right? So. But what he believes is that we have an idea in our minds which is the highest and best thing that can exist. Absolutely perfect being, morally perfect, perfect in knowledge. I think my wife's on the phone over there. Hopefully you guys don't hear that. Anyway, he's perfect in knowledge, perfect in power, perfect in all these different respects. And so what basically happens here, the argument of Anselm, is that such a being has to exist, because if he didn't exist, then that would count against his perfection, right? So existence is an attribute of perfection. And so that's sort of the broad strokes of the argument there. So, you think about a perfect being, how could it be a perfect being if it didn't also exist? So voila, you get kind of an interesting argument. Now, there's more detail to it, but now what Kant says to answer this, and you'll notice this under letter D, all right? He basically says that the problem with the argument is that it treats existence as a property of a subject, or a predicate of a subject. And what he suggests is that just doesn't work rationally. So we have to throw out that idea, all right? And I want to try to illustrate that, okay? So basically, if you had a graph, and you had on one axis things that were lesser and greater, and on another axis you had things that were existent and things that were non-existent, then what you would have is two separate judgments there, right? So you can think of things along the axis of lesser and greater things, and on the existent axis, you can think of things that are relatively lesser and relatively greater. And then you can think of imaginary things that we know are imaginary, right? And you can think about lesser and greater things there. Now, if I keep adding perfections, so to speak, to this axis of non-existent things to make it a greater and greater being, like add Superman or something like that, give him even greater power, even greater intelligence, things like that. Is that going to make him jump into existence? He now exists on the plane of existent things. Well, see, now that's not going to happen, right? So the problem with the ontological argument, Kant gives a pretty good number on Anselm's version, is just that you can't you can't really, that's a separate judgment, I guess is what you would say, right? So you can't make something come into existence by simply adding perfections to it. So therefore existence is not a property of a subject. Okay, perfection and existence, two separate judgments. That's essentially what he's arguing there. All right, I'm going to stop here for now. We're going to revisit Kant a little bit more, explain some of his ethical system on the next little video. All right.